Can everyone see my screen? Okay, great. So hello again, welcome. Our focus for today's workshop webinar is to talk about costs of production. And really, one might argue and say all of the costs that you're incurring in the operations of your business are costs of production. But what we want to try and hone in on are costs that really could make or break a specific revenue channel, a specific market, a specific business product that you're focusing on, because the costs that are associated with that channel may be ones that help make it viable or not. So for us, where are we? Oh, you have our names here. We just met. For us today, the ideal outcome of today's workshop is to begin with to differentiate very specifically between variable and fixed costs, and to review their effect on profitability as a result of them being what they are, one of these two types. From there, to define something that we call contribution margin, really very, and you may have heard of it as gross margin as well, but the reason we're calling it by the name contribution margin is something we go into, but defining contribution margin and then making sure that you incorporate that as a metric in your planning exercises. And then focusing on using the cost of production in any decision making that you may want to be doing at an overall business level. And these might be decisions that are anywhere from figuring out where you're selling to what you're selling to who you're selling it to. And so making the link between variable costs or cost of production and your eventual point of sale, and ensuring that all of this from a numbers perspective creates a viable business for you to work with. So as Olivia mentioned, anytime you have a question, feel free to keep dropping it in the chat. We will address these towards the end. And if there's anything that I see that feels immediately relevant to fold into what we're talking about, we will try and do that as well. Sky, I'm going to take off from here and then just tag team with me as you go along.
Yep,
absolutely. Thank you. Okay, so for those of you who were with me last week when we were talking about financial basics, we did go into this a little bit, and I'm going to reiterate the focus on types of costs. What are we looking at when we look at the costs associated with running a business? Typically, when we look at cash that is coming into a business, it is our revenue. Revenue might come in from your core business operations, anything that you are rearing to sell or creating to sell, any services that you're providing alongside, any potentially non-core pieces as well. So there may be, potentially sale of an asset, something that you own in the business that you no longer need, which might also lead to cash inflow. And then we tend to look at everything that is leading to cash outflow and typify and call it a cost. This is where the type of cost and basically discriminating between them starts to make a fairly large difference to whether the specific business or the line of the enterprise line that you're working on is profitable and makes sense to continue with. So costs in the sort of the grandest, like highest level buckets fall under either variable costs or fixed costs. Variable costs are those costs that are, I'm just going to move this little Zoom window, sorry, out of the way. Variable costs are the ones we want to focus on today. So these are really what we refer to as costs of production. They could be costs associated with pre-production, as in getting to a point where your product is then prepared to be sold, and post-production, which is essentially everything that comes from a point of finishing. So we've split them out here, but the one thing that you want to keep in mind as you're looking at this is that all of these costs, and this is something that we will be specifying over and over again in the next, few minutes, are all of these costs essentially go fairly hand in hand with your revenue. If you're selling more, you're incurring more of these costs. On the other hand, fixed costs tend to be costs that you would be incurring just in the running of your business, potentially regardless of how high or low your sales are. So examples of fixed costs are administrative expenses. This could be, subscription for your accounting software, subscription for an inventory management tool or software, any occupancy costs, so things that any fees or expenses you're paying towards rent, towards insurance for having that building or that space or that barn or that land, any utilities that come from occupying that space. All of those are fixed costs as well. Marketing, so anything that you are investing in order to develop further business or have your customers hear about you. Travel, professional services, taxes, legal, accounting, any other support that you might have alongside, a field consultant, so on. Tools and supplies, so any small picks and knives and small, even fencing, even the larger pieces like costs that you invest in. These are all, even though they don't directly get categorized as fixed costs, we referred to this a little bit in the last week, they are essentially an asset that's owned by your business. All of these take their place under the fixed cost category. The reason we're looking at these from this perspective is that typically a cost of production, which is the variable costs, as I mentioned, grow fairly proportionally with revenue. So for instance, depending on what your business model is, if you're selling livestock, if you're essentially selling live head, you have breeding stock, you're raising head, and then you're selling them live. The more you sell, the more you're spending on bringing up your product for sale. If you're selling packaged meat products, if you're essentially working through the harvesting and processing and packaging chain to get to a point where you are then selling product, the more you sell, the more you're investing in everything, whether it's the processing costs or the packaging that goes around it, the labeling, even the shipping and the freight associated with it. These are all your variable costs. Your fixed costs can grow as operations grow, because one of the questions that we often receive is, yeah, but as I sell more, I'm also paying more in utilities, I'm buying more supplies, I am potentially replacing the infrastructure that I've put in place. And it's an interesting question, because yes, these costs do grow as your operations grow, but they don't necessarily leap with your revenue as it leaps up. So if you were to essentially look at the curve of revenue and your variable costs following it, they would more or less stay parallel. I mean, sure, there are efficiencies to be gained, because the more you do of something, you can gain volume efficiencies, you can get lower price tiers on things, but in general, variable costs will more or less move in line with your revenue. Your fixed costs may follow a line of course, and then take a leap up, because you have to invest in more space or hire somebody else to support growing operations, or suddenly work on replacing, your entire suite of tools that you're working with in running your operations. And so typically you'll see them follow a relatively steady state, jump up every time you have to make that next investment, and then continue on a relatively steady state line before it's the next time that you invest in them. The reason we want to distinguish between these costs is that because variable costs tend to move fairly hand in hand with revenue, the higher these costs are, the less or the lower you have left over to cover everything else. So think about it. If you, for instance, for every $10 in product that you sell, and you incur variable costs, essentially the feed, the care, and we'll go through an entire list of them shortly, the harvesting, processing, packaging, freight, etc., costs you $5 for every $10 in sales that you sell. That leaves you with 5. The 10 less the 5 that you spend, it leaves you with $5 to cover all of your other expenses, including your fixed costs, the ones below. And so if your variable costs go up, and we've seen that happen in the last few years, the pandemic has made a huge difference with respect to logistics. It's made a huge difference with respect to supply and distribution of all sorts, and to all of our costs of production, materials in general, feed, all of it has been affected. The higher these costs get, the more they squeeze what's left over from revenue to be able to cover everything else that comes below. Whereas fixed costs generally are left to be covered by this difference above. And so this is why one of the reasons we're speaking about cost of production today is to really just hone in on this upper piece and note that it is something that you want to separate from the rest of the cloud of costs that exists, to make sure that you're essentially looking at what moves hand in hand or one-on-one with your revenue. I'm going to pause for a second just because I'm seeing, Lip, sorry, just seeing your comment. And Skya also taking a breath so that you can chime in.
Yeah, no, I think that was great. It was very comprehensive, and the examples are super helpful. Like Anjali was saying, butchering one more animal is going to have like an extra slaughter charge, but it's not going to make like your accountant bill go up any higher butchering. So that's also kind of an easy way to differentiate between like a variable cost and a fixed cost. Is doing one more going to really change anything, and stuff like that. So.
Okay.
We have one hand up. Should I pause now, or you want to ask this question?
Sure. Let's.
Okay. So, Tasha, why don't you go ahead and ask us your question? Okay, Tasha, we can't hear you, but maybe if you do have still a question, drop it in the chat and we will take a look, or in the Q&A. All right, let's keep going. I don't know, maybe she might have raised her hand by mistake.
Okay. All right, moving on from distinguishing between cost types. Sorry. Okay. I'm gonna, where am I? Okay. So just gonna reiterate something that we went over in our Financial Basics 1 class, which I believe everyone then has access to with both the presentation as well as the video later, but going to reiterate this particular financial statement, the one we hear the most about, a profit and loss statement. So a profit and loss statement is one of 3 key financial statements. Last week, we went over the 3 of them. That's the profit and loss statement, the balance sheet, and the cash flow statement. This is the one that comes up most in general reviews and viewing, though I am going to argue that the other 2 are equally important. However, this is the one that is probably the fastest to generate once you start keeping track of your numbers, and one of the ones that you would be looking at most frequently. A profit and loss statement essentially tells you how your business is operating over a period of time. It tends to follow a fairly sort of a fixed format, one that many of us are familiar with. You start out with revenue, and keeping in mind that the P&L or profit and loss statement, also called the income statement, is generally looked at when we look at it over a period of time. We basically say, okay, how did we do this month? How did we do in this last week? how are we doing over this quarter? How are we doing over a year? It essentially covers a period in time to tell you how the business has been running over that period. Both of these costs that we just looked at, the variable and the fixed costs, have their own place in a profit and loss statement. So I'm starting out with this little graphic, but then essentially jumping into the structure as well. Revenue, we just talked about, every dollar made is revenue, right? It might come from the sale of a product, that's your operating revenue. It might come from interest from, say, a bank account, that is non-operating revenue, or it could come from selling something that you don't need anymore. You have that tractor or truck or freezer that you might have sold that you don't need anymore, and that's the sale of an asset. So again, all of these are considered revenue. Some of these are repeating or recurring. Essentially, your operating revenue is the one that is going to be recurring on an ongoing basis. The other two don't really count so much. The interest, one, because interest is basically negligible on anything that you today put your money into, but also because and in the grand scheme of things is a drop in the bucket compared to everything else. And the sale of an asset is not something that you're going to be doing all the time. It may be a one-off and not necessarily related, and not at all, in fact, related to the cost that you're incurring along the way. So in our focus here, when we look at revenue in this middle section where you see the gross profit is equal to revenue minus cost of goods, for us, revenue really is your operating revenue. Then you have your cost of goods sold. These are the variable costs we just talked about. For every gain, inflow, cash inflow coming in, there is a cost associated with just getting that product ready and out the door. It's not about the money that you spend on keeping the lights on or about servicing to make sure that your books are in shape or your taxes are filed or etc. It's really just getting your product out the door. And so these are costs that vary with the quantity of products sold. And it could either be the cost of the actual product itself or the cost of producing and then selling it, and or the cost of then getting it to its final place of being. Revenue minus these costs of goods sold is what gives us a very important metric called gross profit. Gross profit is really just what is left over once you take into account the fact that you've sold, once you've taken into account that this product cost has been accounted for. These two metrics in the middle are the ones that I would say are principal, key to track, not just for your business as a whole, but for every line of business that you may be running within it. So for instance, if you're selling live head and then you're selling cuts, packaged and processed cuts, and if you're first selling, one, and then in the packaged processed cuts, you're selling them to farmers markets and restaurants and in a CSA, for instance, each of these have their own method of bringing revenue in to you and their own very specific costs associated with them. So figuring out these particular metrics before the rest of it, everything on the right even comes into play is super important. And so your gross profit is essentially revenue minus any variable cost. And then your gross margin is taking that gross profit and dividing it by revenue. This gives you a percentage to work with. The higher this percentage, the more you are retaining of your revenue to now be able to start covering your fixed costs. So fixed costs are all the ones that we were just talking about. They basically are fixed, not that they never change, just that they don't grow proportionally with revenue. And then you have what comes down further in a P&L. I'm going to switch to this view so that this is one that you would have potentially commonly seen. If you're keeping track on paper, in a spreadsheet, through an accounting software. All of those are good things. Keeping track, starting to keep track is the most important piece here. And then starting to split out what you're keeping track of across these various buckets is what starts to make the difference in helping your decision making. So we have revenue. I keep specifying these costs of goods sold, and you have a fairly comprehensive set of examples here, but there may be more associated with your operations depending on how they're running. So pre-production, it could include feed, any medicine or vet care, any ongoing maintenance that might come from just general sort of livestock maintenance that, and again, this doesn't mean things that don't go up as your herd size grows. So any general normal maintenance costs that come into play with the increase. One of the examples, and I believe AJ, you're going to be speaking about this, is let's say you have poultry and having coops, having basically your housing structures for the poultry is very much a part of maintenance too, because even though this is a cost that feels like it's fixed, the more you're going to be selling, the more you're going to be essentially growing your livestock, the size of your herd or the size of your flock, the more you're going to be investing in this and having this grow alongside. So pre-production is anything that grows as your herd size grows. Post-production are all of the costs that then come into play with getting your product ready to sell. You may notice, okay, with post-production, we have transport, we have slaughtering fees, fabrication, packaging, storage, which might grow the more you're storing. Even if you have a flat fee, there potentially is more, particularly if you're renting space to store. And then labor, which we're going to have a separate note on. I keep saying if segregated because of the fact that labor often gets mixed up with doing a lot of things on the farm. There are additional costs of sales as well. Even though these are not costs of production, these are costs that grow as your sales grow. For example, if people are paying you by credit card, it's a high, or any other platform that essentially takes a cut, the more they use that platform, the more you're paying in merchant service fees. So it's a variable cost. Any commissions that you might be paying, any discounts that you might be offering are also a cost that could be increasing the more your sales grow. So when you're looking at a normal, like a P&L structure, you'll often you may have seen some where you say, well, costs are costs. Why would we be splitting them? The reason you want to be splitting them is to get to precisely this metric that we have in here. That's your gross profit. Your gross profit gives you your gross margin, which is essentially an equation that is your revenue minus your cost of goods sold divided by your revenue. And this is what contributes to covering the rest of your business expenses, including your income. Whether or not you're taking it from the business, what you should be paying yourself is also going to be covered by what's left over after your cost of production occur. Okay, I'm going to stop for a second for questions, contributions.
Yes, I got a couple of things I wanted to add. If you're brand new and kind of getting started out in this, a good place to help you find those pre-production costs might be your Schedule F on your taxes. A lot of our, and another piece of advice, a lot of our producers look at their finances once a year when it is tax time, because your typical agriculture structures operate on an annual cycle, an annual production cycle. So they look at their costs annually. With this, since there is more coming in and out on a monthly basis and different things like that, it's super, super important that you look at your P&L and you figure out these numbers more than once a year. You don't want to work once a year, or you don't want to work all year just to figure out you lost a little bit of money because you didn't factor in some costs and things like that. So when you're moving into this new format and selling boxed beef directly to producers, it's super, super important that you keep an eye on these finances, especially right away as you're getting established and you're getting things figured out and you're getting used to these finances and things coming in and out more frequently, so that you don't work for a whole year just to figure out that you lost some money. We don't want to see that happen. So
Perfect. Thanks, Kaya. It completely on point. And people often say, how often should I be looking at my numbers? I'm going to err on the side of saying as often as possible, but I also know that that isn't necessarily possible in the day-to-day operations and things. I would say that finding a period of time that feels regular, and typically monthly is a pretty good place to start, because sometimes, even looking at things on a weekly basis could make all the difference. But with the types of businesses we are talking about here, essentially taking a look at what's going on a month-to-month basis might be sufficient to start, just to have a good sense of what the rhythms are and where, and essentially taking a look at where you're also starting to see points where cash is dangerously low, or that you have to be ready to deal with all of these costs in handling what's coming up for your sales. And one of the things that I think, and I mentioned this up as well, is that here's the thing with variable costs. You sometimes don't find out that they are higher than you anticipated because they happen in advance of your sales. And by the time your sales have occurred and you're looking at what the incoming is, it's almost too late to be looking back to seeing what they were.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes some of your vendors might only bill you monthly or quarterly, semi-annually. So that's also something to take into consideration when you're doing stuff like this.
Before you guys move on, I just want to also add a little shout out to the paper method or the Excel method. We have an upcoming webinar about starting to use accounting software, but this right here is your cheat sheet for how to be calculating your cost of production, even if you're not using anything that's going to do it for you, right? This is the categories that we're suggesting that you start to keep track of in a different way. So you could take this basically and start to organize your receipts in folders and boxes that have these titles on them. And that's a great place to start. So just a little chew up to the analog systems. It's totally transferable. All of this is doable in that world as well.
100%. Okay. All right. So moving into the costs of production. We've spelled them out in some more detail here. And again, this comes down to what your particular business model is. Depending on how you're selling, what you're selling, and who you're selling to, and also actually where you are. A lot of these might differ. Some of these might be relevant. Some of these might not be. And what we've tried to do is kind of cover the universe of costs to sort of think about when you're thinking about variable costs. So live head, essentially selling, raising and selling within your herd. You may have pre-production costs that are everything that we talked through: feed, vet medicine, any maintenance or small pieces of equipment. I'm not talking about large sort of investments that you make for something that is going to last you for a number of years. Again, this one is a little bit of a gray area, and I know AJ, you've got a great example in terms of, so I'm going to leave it to that. Labor, question mark for me, always. We'll come to that in a minute. Transport to sale. Let's say you're selling dressed, but not packaged and in cuts. You know, harvesting, slaughter becomes a really important part in terms of your pre-production costs as well. The more you sell, the more you're going to be seeing this. And then you have your packaged cuts where everything on the post-production also starts to become super important and to take into consideration when you're thinking about your costs. So any VAP, any transportation to cold storage, the cold storage itself, if you are paying for it, any transport to get things there and to get them out, any labels, printing, packaging, etc., that you may have to do to get the product up and running, and potentially more labor. So these are all of the costs. Like when you're thinking about this is what I'm going to be selling, these are literally all of the costs that you want to list out and say, okay, what are the costs that are associated with my making this sale happen? Whether you're working on it in a hypothetical sense, here's my plan for the next 6 months, here's my plan for the year, or whether you're looking at real numbers that you have before you that have already occurred, listing them down this way and separating out all the rest. We're not saying that the other costs aren't real. They're very real. Rent is real. People are real. Anything that you're doing to get the word out, the marketing, any professional services, those are real, but those do not intrude in your setting this piece up to determine what your margins are going to be. Why do I keep saying question mark next to labor? Something to consider with respect to labor is, number one, it has to be recognized in planning. Any planning that you do, people, including yourself, are a key part of this. You may be in a place where you're not paying yourself. I would still say pin down a hypothetical number. This is what I need to be making, even if I'm not making it today, in order for this to feel like a viable business. The reason we want you to do this, the reason it makes sense to do this, is because if you don't, we all know we're the first ones to put ourselves behind saying, let me make the business work. The business is not working if you're not getting from it what you need in order to be able to live. So even if it's a hypothetical number, it needs to be put in there. Where you include it, the cost of production, all these costs that we've been going over, or operating expenses, may depend on its purpose and how payment is structured. So any labor that is involved in production and compensated per unit time on the job. So, you know, you essentially have somebody helping you, or even if you were to put your own real or ideal costs in, if you're essentially putting it as here is dollars per hour on this particular job associated with production, it can be included in the cost of production. Any labor that's involved in production and compensated full time, not per unit time, but basically on a salary level, may almost certainly include tasks that are not associated with production. There's always, you know, something happened administratively, you're following up on stuff, some level of cleanup. There's a blip out with electricity and something needed to be handled, a fence broke and that piece needed to be fixed. It skews costs of production when you have a mixed definition job or person on, and so in such a case you could put them under cost of production, but it may seem like your cost of production are higher than they should be. I generally err towards putting this kind of cost under operating expenses, with the understanding that my cost of production is a little bit incomplete, in the sense that it has all of the costs associated with it, and there is an estimate that I'm going to put in place for saying, plus, you know, I need to make this much more margin because it needs to account for people. And then labor not directly related to production. So anything that is really just administrative work, management work, making sure the lights are on, the rent is paid, the books are kept, the supplies are purchased, that type of thing, definitely an operating expense. So you want to incorporate labor in your planning based on how you view people operationally. Are they part of the production process? Are they part of management admin? Are they really like very mixed up? And in which case, keep them on one side, always noting that you have to have an estimate on the other side to make up for it. I've said this here, ensuring that your operational categories line up with your accounting ones. The reason we say this is, at the end of the day, any tracking that you are doing, anything that you're doing here in terms of tracking your numbers, will only feel relevant to you if it reflects what's happening on the ground. So if you look at this and say, hey, you're missing 5 categories of costs that I think about when in terms of getting my product ready to market. Number one, I'm very curious to know what they are because we'd love to add them here. And 2, add them, keep track of them. Because if it feels to you that something is relevant in making sure that something gets to market, that means likely that it deserves a place here. It's only if what's happening on the ground is not matching the way you're keeping track of your numbers, because you're like, here's a list I received, I'm just going to follow this list, but it's really not at all related to what's happening on the ground. You will stop looking at that list someday because it's just not going to make sense to you. So not just with labor, with every other cost, when you're putting your list and your categories and naming your folders and starting to drop them in, if you look at something here and say, I would understand this better if it was named differently, just name it differently. Or if you had an added category, just add it in there. Pausing.
I just wanted to jump in a couple thoughts about labor. I want to preface this by saying I grew up on a ranch, so I am fully aware of ranchers being so used to working year round for minimal labor or for minimal salary. You're probably like $2 an hour, right? I'm used to that. However, the whole point of this is to get you out of that cycle of kind of surviving and thriving and your quality of life better. And your time and your talent and your quality of life is definitely worth something. So when you're factoring in labor, make sure you're paying yourself a living wage. The accountants that you're contracting with are paying themselves a living wage. The slaughter facility that you're working with, they are paying themselves a living wage. And it's so important that you guys do as well. We're trying to work towards getting out of that cycle of surviving into thriving, and your time, your talent, your quality of life, your effort is definitely worth something. So don't sell yourself short, and make sure to factor that in when you're doing all this cost of production.
Thank you. And yeah, hypothetical is a good place to start, but real is where you want to get to. So actually making it happen. And this is why when, starting to include those numbers in there to say, here's what I would be paying myself, here's what I can pay myself, and here's what I will pay myself. Just getting to that line of thought starts with recognizing that you have a space in that line of costs as much as anything else that's in there. Okay, so your cost of production, let's say now that you're starting to list out all of these costs that we said are variable associated with each piece. Where it starts becoming, where you want to now work with it is map it to your planned revenue for whatever your product is. And I keep saying this, what you're selling, who you're selling it to, where you're selling it, and how you're selling it. Because, whether it's a CSA or a farmer's market or working with some kind of an aggregator platform or working with a local restaurant, depending on whatever that is, that may change this dollar per pound idea a lot. And so for you to basically look at this and say, okay, here are all the costs associated with these various stages, depending on where my business falls. And now what is a real, like an actual market price that I am receiving versus or a hypothetical market price if you're working on planning. What is the revenue that would be coming into the business depending on where I am? And you may be doing all three of these. You may be choosing to focus on one. You may have a completely added or a separate sort of a VAP line that we haven't even shown here. But depending on what that is, looking at what your unit revenue is, your dollar per pound is, and then correlating that back to your cost of production is where we start looking at contribution margin. So I'm going to go up for a second here. This is where you laid out your specific cost of production, costs of production, depending on where your business falls in this. You also then lay out what your real or planned revenue is based on what market pricing looks like. And what that then gives you is essentially a grid. It allows you to look at, here's what I'm going to be earning, and here are the direct costs associated with making this revenue happen. Bear in mind, we're still not talking about fixed costs. We're not there. That comes in later, because what we're trying to do, what you're working on, is maximizing what's left over, that gross profit, from looking at the revenue and the associated costs with each. So gross margin. Gross margin is, we looked at this within the P&L context, but it's basically your revenue less these costs of production divided by your revenue. Even if I was to take away the divided by the revenue, right? Gross profit, it's basically saying, here's what I'm earning, and here are the direct variable costs associated with that. What's left over is then, that's what I've got to be able to cover the rest of the costs in my business. The reason we make this revenue down here in the denominator, in this equation, is because this then allows us to look at things from a percentage perspective, basically saying, here's what's left, here's what I've got. If I sell this type of product in the farmer's market and I look at cost of production, I make 50%. If I sell via CSA, I make 45%. If I sell to a local restaurant, I make 40%. Starting to put this particular equation in place starts to make it uniform or standardize the metric that you're using to compare against various revenue channels. The gross margin is what we also call the contribution margin. This is really, now it's contributing to covering the rest of your business. And so map out your cost of production for the various things you're selling and how you're selling them in. Map out what your revenue potential is, and what you're basically aiming at getting to is something that looks like this, not in terms of graphics, but in terms of telling you what your percentages or your margins are left over. So for instance, if I was to say, hey, I'm selling live head, and I'm either selling them, I'm selling cows at full grown cows, either in the live market or dressed or as cuts. And I look at my cost of production associated with each of them, I may see that it makes most sense, depending on how the market is priced, for me to be selling them as cuts. On the other hand, if I'm selling on the younger side of the spectrum, I may look at something and say, well, harvesting costs are just too high for something of this nature, and then I don't get the revenue that's associated with them. What you're essentially heading towards is forming a grid that gives you an idea of everything you're able to sell, the associated costs with them, and to be able to see where you're landing at in terms of high or low profitability. the goal here, before we approach, as I keep saying, before we approach operating or fixed costs, is to look at your cost of production with the lens of, is this particular business line viable? Am I going to keep continuing to sell this way, or does it just not make sense at all? Because for every unit that I sell, I'm looking at the bottom right corner here, my cost of production are higher than the money that I'm making on the market. So the more I sell, the more I'm losing. On the flip side, does it make sense for me to focus on the top right corner here? Because I have a fairly good margin in that for everything I sell, my cost of production are fairly on the lower side. I keep more of the dollars that I gain, and maybe that's where I need to be focusing on. So breaking up your channels and their associated costs can help you get to this sort of state of, this kind of an analysis, then that basically helps you then figure out what are the pieces you want to continue with versus those that might make sense to drop. Skaya, gonna pause.
Yeah, I have nothing to add. I think that was great and super helpful. And it's always good to sit back, analyze, look at what you're doing, what's working, what maybe needs to be a little bit different with the world we live in, and because things are always changing. And so yeah, I think that this is great.
The one additional thing I would add here too is that sometimes you might choose to continue, in this case, a theoretical square or rectangle on the grid for a reason that is not necessarily margin related. For instance, selling more in, basically selling more in a place where you have a lower profit margin, let's just say bottom middle, might actually increase the chances of your selling top middle. So basically, sometimes you're taking on a particular channel of sale, even though you don't necessarily have the best margin associated with it, in order to be able to get the word out. It's almost like investing in something like a marketing cost to put yourself forward, to say, hey, I'm willing to take a little bit of a drop or a cut or a loss on this front because it gets people to hear about me. And then I can sell more of the other stuff. Sometimes you don't want to drop a line just because it's legacy and it's come to you from generations and family before you, and you want to continue with it. And that's fine too, as long as overall within the larger context of your business, it makes sense for you to have it and it doesn't affect your cash flow or business viability in a way that is causing you to lose money overall. So this is the economic lens is the one that we're coming into this workshop with, looking at things. You keep the channels, you keep the ways that are the strongest on the margin side that help you keep the most on the dollar. But if you choose to keep some of the others, it should be with this idea in mind that you've chosen it for a reason, whether it's for marketing or continuing a tradition or selling something just because you love selling it and the local market loves it, even though you may not gain so much on it. Having this in mind will at the very least, have you be conscious of that. All right. Some very quick parting thoughts. I'm going to refer back to Skye's note on the Schedule F. It's a great place to start with starting to just isolate what your production costs are, and take a look at starting to isolate what these are and making it happen more than once a year. Break even. We often refer to this. We'll be referring to it again in one of the future workshops that we will be doing. What you're essentially always trying to do with any channel of business that you go into is to make sure that your revenue at the very least covers for your cost of production. It needs to be doing more than that. But if it doesn't even do that, it's time to revisit and determine if you're really going ahead with it. At the very least, needs to cover cost of production, because then what's left over covers everything else that we've talked about. Your fixed costs, including potentially you, if you've put yourself in that operating expense capacity. You may look at that grid that we just looked at and say, hey, this is great. There are 2 things out of 5 that I'm doing that really seem to have a very high margin potential. That's what I'm going to go after. This is where the next 2 notes become pretty relevant. Do you have the capacity to produce what is needed in order to go full on with those specific lines? And is there enough demand in the market to make that happen? So sometimes we may isolate and recognize what are the highest margin pieces of a business, but there are 3 people buying that particular product from us. So looking at what your own production capacity is and the fact that there is a demand in the market for it is super important. Liv, I know I'd love for you to jump in here because I'm not entirely certain on our timing for sharing yield and margin tools. AJ has, and this is where I'm also going to lean in on AJ's starting to share his particular tools with us. But just wanted to check in on the timing for that.
Yeah, I think we're good to transition if you guys are. In terms of, I'd love to hear from AJ and look at some of the ways that he calculates his costs and then determines his pricing and take us on his journey. And then there is going to be a future webinar on some of the tools that Anjali and I have built in general for calculating yield and gross margin in a different format. So I think for now we're good to, unless there's anything else that Anjali and Sky just want to add as quick best practices, let's transition to AJ and see what he does.
Yes, let's go to AJ. Super excited to learn from him and what's worked for him.
All right, AJ, I'm gonna go with the next, and then just cue me in every time you want to switch a slide.
Sounds good. Thanks. Awesome. A lot of good stuff there, and I think that some of the things that I'm going to show you, we can hopefully apply a lot of that terminology. I think. So, just who am I? AJ Granelli. I was born in New York State about 10 years ago this spring. I moved here to South Dakota. I was a teacher. Somewhere in that path of being a teacher for a while, I live in a very rural community. It's far to the grocery store, so I got a few chickens and figured out how to butcher them in the backyard. Had all my friends over. It took us all day, sort of thing. And then the neighbors wanted to buy some, and so then I used that money to buy some more chickens. And I kind of spiraled with that until a few years ago, I got the bright idea to quit my job and take this full time. So I've kind of learned on the run what I needed to do. I was no longer getting a paycheck from the school. I needed to make sure that the money I was spending in my entrepreneurial ventures, I guess, was covering the costs. And ideally, I'd get a little off the top too. So let's go to the next slide. So I own and operate Homegrown Pork and Poultry. Right now, I lease just 10 acres. I farrow to finish about 60, 70 hogs a year, and then we'll sell a few dozen piglets, a couple thousand chickens. I raise on pasture meat chickens, and then we are able to process them on farm and sell them retail in the state of South Dakota. I also have a market garden so I'm on the weekends and through the summer at farmers markets and things like that. So I'm not a big time farmer. I'm not taking over feeding the world all of a sudden, but I'm making it work for me and the small amount of land that I do have. But I think a lot of this is going to be applicable for various sizes. I also work as the farm director for Makoche Agriculture Development at a Porcupine. I believe that many of you, if you were here last month's class, Nick, the CEO for Makoche, talked about maybe business structures, or I'm not sure what his, yeah, all right. So at Makoche, our mission is to develop indigenous agriculture and food systems designed to regenerate equitable, healthy communities, economies, and our environment. At Makoche, we are in the process of building a poultry-centered regenerative farm. So we're hoping to grow 30,000 chickens a year in that, and alongside that, we are building a USDA inspected poultry processing facility. So that's a pretty cool opportunity for our community out here. There is not poultry processing within an 8-hour direction anyway. So we're hoping that we can start to transform some things. We have a lot of projects going on. I check out our website at Makoche. There's a lot of neat stuff, and we're always looking to connect with more people in our local and regional community. So, disclaimer, I am definitely not an accountant. I am a former math teacher, so I guess that helps a little bit maybe, but really anybody can do this. The hardest part is going to be sitting down and just writing down what it is that you spent money on. It's very easy to say like, oh, this didn't cost anything, or I already own this, or forget a receipt. But it's just starting. That's the hardest part. So with that said, let's dive into some applications, I guess. Yeah, we can skip to the next one. We're going to just start by looking at a really basic, slimmed down budget. So this is for chickens. I've taken my longer spreadsheet and kind of combined some things so we can actually fit it on a slide and you can make sense of this. So there may be other costs that you're thinking of in additional categories that you can think of, and I've tried to just squeeze them together. But the basis here is that I'm figuring out not just my total cost of production for this enterprise, but I have it broken down down to individual chicken. When we earlier talked about variable and fixed costs, a good way that I compartmentalize them in my mind is variable costs are going to have a direct relationship with the amount of production. So not necessarily the amount of sales, depending on where we are in our sales avenue. But if you don't sell it, it still costs you something, right? So the more chicks I have, the more chicks I buy, that's literally a directly related cost to every quantity. But a fixed cost, I'm trying to reduce them in a per unit production. So a per chick production. The larger I scale, the less it costs for that category. So an example being my pigs or something. Let's say I have an acre fenced out. It costs me, we'll say $500 to fence that acre. If I only put one pig in that all summer, that $500 has to be split just in one. If I'm able to grow 10 pigs in there, so then our cost of production per unit is going down. That's how I get to things like wholesale pricing, when I know I need to get a certain quantity to make a cost effective. If you buy a $20,000 or a $50,000 tractor and you've got one cow, that doesn't exactly span out great. If you're able to produce 100 to market size, now we're splitting that cost up. So I'm going to kind of use that principle in some of these things. Now, looking at this chart, as we go down, there's also some things that I kind of amortize over several years, or the lifespan of his expected use. I hear a lot of people in their businesses, or a lot of more often smaller business, or even established, where a small enterprise is going to be started in a larger farm operation. We already had this, or